Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2024 FUBA AAS Homecoming Lecture. My name is Corey D.B. Walker. I'm Dean of the Wake Forest University School of Divinity, Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and Director of the Program in African American Studies. We're delighted to welcome you here for our fourth annual AWFUBA AAS Homecoming Lecture. Of course, this lecture begins our homecoming week here at Wake Forest, and we're excited to have each and every one of you join us and begin your homecoming celebration with us here on the Renolda campus, even if you're joining us virtually. Today's intergenerational conversation is a true intellectual feast as we welcome two of our newest faculty members in the program of African American Studies for a conversation on the theme Then and Now, African American Studies at Wake Forest University. I will introduce our conversational partners as well as our exceptional moderator, who was our second speaker in this annual homecoming lecture series, our very own Dr. Shanna Greene Benjamin. Our first conversational partner and newest member of the African American Studies community here at Wake Forest is Professor Eshe Sherley. Professor Sherley is a historian of Black politics, gender, sexuality, and labor in the 20th century United States. Before joining African American Studies here at Wake Forest, Eshe was postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. Dr. Sherley received a BA in African American Studies from Yale University and a PhD in history from the University of Michigan with a concentration in women's and gender studies. Dr. Sherley is currently working on a monograph tentatively titled Fighting for Life: How Black Women Transformed the Politics of Labor and Reproduction in Atlanta from 1968 to 1985. This text tells the story of how a network of Black women activists became key political players in Atlanta and challenged both white and Black political leadership in the city. Her work has been supported by the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the Center for Engaged Scholarship, and the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice in Durham, North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eshe Sherley. We are delighted to welcome back to Wake Forest, and we are delighted to welcome back to Wake Forest a dear friend of our intellectual community and truly a pioneer who laid the foundation and groundwork for the program in African American Studies. His extensive knowledge, leadership, and experience have been extremely beneficial, not only to Wake Forest University, but universities across the nation. And he currently occupies the James and Marilyn Dunn Chair in the School of Divinity, and he occupies the highest university honor for a professor, being named University Professor of African American Studies. This individual is none other than Dr. Alton B. Pollard III. Previously, Dr. Pollard served as the 10th president of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, where upon conclusion of his distinguished service as a leader of that leading theological institution, he was named President Emeritus. A scholar, author, consultant, and speaker on the subject of African American and U.S. religion and culture, Dr. Pollard was previously Dean of the School of Divinity and Professor of Religion and Culture at Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C. Prior to his 11 years at Howard University, Dr. Pollard served as Director of Black Church Studies and Chair of American Religious Cultures at Emory University, and he also taught at St. Olaf College. Professor Pollard is author and editor of 7 books, beginning with the groundbreaking text, Mysticism and Social Change, The Social Witness of Howard Thurman, and the acclaimed The Black Church Studies Reader. He has published over 50 scholarly journal articles and book chapters, and numerous articles, essays, and commentaries for a broad general audience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alton Pollard. Our moderator for today's conversation is none other than our very own Professor Shanna Greene Benjamin, the first full professor and first full tenured professor in the program in African American Studies at Wake Forest University. A distinguished scholar, teacher, and academic leader, Dr. Benjamin is a scholar of African American literature, literary criticism, and literary studies. She has developed a robust body of scholarship grounded in African American literary studies that extends and deepens the discipline of African American studies. She also contributes, her scholarship also contributes to the fields of Black feminist studies and gender and sexuality studies. She has leveraged her scholarly insights to inform and advance her academic leadership, thereby contributing a distinctive voice and vision serving both the university and the broader profession. Prior to joining the faculty at Wake Forest University, Dr. Benjamin was a tenured full professor of English and associate dean of the college at Grinnell College, one of the nation's premier national liberal arts universities. She is author of the well-received monograph, Half in Shadow, The Life and Legacy of Nellie McKay, which announces her unique invitation to engage African Americans' women's biography and American intellectual life. Her scholarly writings have found a broad audience in the academy, and her articles have appeared in such leading scholarly venues as AB, Autobiography Studies, African American Review, the CLA Journal, Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, and Studies in American Fiction. She has received a number of awards and honors, including most recently support for her scholarship through the Howard Foundation Fellowship and an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship. Dr. Benjamin's scholarship combines the best of deep thinking, patient development, and continuous and sustained contributions, both to the life of the mind and to the academy. Please join me in welcoming my moderator for today, Dr. Shanna Greene Benjamin. And now for our conversation, I'll turn it over to Dr. Benjamin, who will engage both Dr. Sherley and Dr. Pollard on today's topic. Once again, welcome, and I'm sure you'll find this to be a truly stimulating event.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here to have an opportunity to learn some new things about my colleagues, but also to use this as an occasion to introduce you to the broader community of Wake Forest faculty, students, friends, and alums. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a little bit of autobiography. How did you each come to Black Studies? Dr. Sherley, we'll start with you.
Sure. First, I just want to say I'm so excited to be here and be in conversation with Dr. Pollard and you, Dr. Benjamin. I came to Black Studies, maybe like a lot of you came to Wake as a scared first-year student coming into a predominantly white institution, trying to find my intellectual but also communal home on campus. And Black Studies took me in, and took me in both socially, with the faculty who took care of me, but also intellectually, and really provided the breadth that I needed as a thinker to answer the questions that I was interested in at that time. And part of what that meant for me as a college student long ago, but maybe not that long ago, given this intergenerational conversation, was that I really was looking for the tools to think about what Black politics could look like in the future. And that meant that I needed history as much as I needed political science, as much as I needed the cultural studies that Black Studies does. And my kind of undergraduate training at Yale at that time really provided me with that breadth that I couldn't find elsewhere on campus, and supported my intellectual development, trying to ask these questions myself. So I think the last thing I would say kind of in answering this question is that the scholars at my undergraduate institution also really understood this idea of a wider Black Studies network, of connecting with scholars beyond your home institution to really build a world of Black intellectual connection. And so as a part of that, they sent me to the Schomburg Library in Harlem. I think still the biggest repository of materials about Black life and history, perhaps in the world, certainly in the United States. And at the Schomburg, I met my Black Studies interlocutors who I continue to work with today, amazingly. People who now have PhDs like me are starting in African American Studies departments like I am around the country. And it was really at the Schomburg at 20, 21 years old as we debated these classic Black Studies topics around religion, around politics, around the role of violence in African American history, that we created the camaraderie, but also the intellectual rigor to become scholars who could be a part of the field now 10 years later.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Pollard, how about you? How did you come to Black Studies?
Well, thank you, Dr. Benjamin, and for the question, and to, I think, keep it brief. I would simply say that my coming to Black Studies was a coming to myself in life. And what I simply mean by that is I grew up in an all-white community. And our family was the only Black family for miles around. We were not supposed to be in that community. And restrictive covenants were in place to keep Black folk out. And my parents in the early 60s found themselves with a home that they were not expecting to have. My parents came out of the cauldron of 1955 in Money, Mississippi. They grew up less than an hour away from there and determined that with the lynching of Emmett Till, like so many Black folk at the time, it was time to leave. And one of the summative values of my existence, I was born with justice as one of those, with freedom as another, with dignity as yet another. And in my own experience growing up in this estranged environment of my own, where white incivility and hostility was a given, it became incumbent for me, imperative, in fact, to find the tools, the resources that were going to enable me to have a profound sense of self, which I found in the fledgling Black community of my home, but also that I found in the immersive experience of the Black books, the literature that my parents put around me, and my siblings from the earliest of days. My parents were not high school graduates, but they made sure that they provided us with the access, the tools to equip ourselves in ways that would be profound. And once they saw that we were reading The Souls of Black Folk, once they saw that we were reading A Raisin in the Sun, once they saw us reading My Bondage and My Freedom, and on, these books that they had placed on the shelf and never mentioned, they were just sitting there. But when curiosity overtook, then they started requiring that we do weekly reports. And the weekly reports turn into oral engagement. And this was the beginning of my intellectual excursus, born out of the cauldron of the 60s, when 1968 came and the manhood signs emerged across Memphis, Tennessee, and death and martyrdom followed shortly thereafter. I was a young man, but and I was starting to feel my oats. But I knew that if I was going to have a future in a society that had done what it did to Emmett Till and had done what it had done to me, and I never let on to my parents what violence was at every hand, I knew that I was going to have to be absolutely dedicated to the engagement of peoples of African descent and my exploration of Black studies began at that point. And when I was fortunate enough to go to college, went to a historically Black institution in Nashville, Tennessee, Fisk University. And there I met some of the ancestors come to life in James Bevel, Diane Nash, and James Lawson, and C.T. Vivian, and John Lewis. These were people from Fisk and Meharry Medical School and American Baptist College, or it was American Baptist Seminary back then, and from Pearl High School, the neighboring Black high school adjacent to Fisk. I learned here what it meant to be immersed yet again in a constellation, a magnificent constellation of Blackness. And I lived in Du Bois Hall, where I was able to relish the profundity of what it meant to be a member of a world that was not quote unquote minority, but that was in fact a part of a majority uprising across the globe with independence in African contexts and with a determination to be free in many others, including the United States of America. And I've never stopped running with Black studies since.
Thank you so much for those answers. I have to say that I think what is striking about both of your remarks are certain through lines that I noticed. And one has to do with Dr. Sherley, you were talking about the Schomburg and the network building an intellectual community. And Dr. Pollard, you mentioned these constellations of Blackness. And so I find it fascinating that in the midst of those spaces, you both talked about how you would access tools that you needed, a vocabulary that you needed to describe, account for experiences that you knew were central, but were peripheral to certain educational experiences, and perhaps in communities where we were underrepresented. I want to I want to pick up on this intergenerational piece. Oh, and before I get going too far, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. Professor Walker is going to step in from time to time as needed if there are questions related to the remarks offered by today's speakers. But anything else we can also reserve for the end if they are more summative in nature. So in keeping with the intergenerational focus of the lecture, I'd love for y'all to help us get a sense of the shifts that have occurred within the discipline since its inception. So Dr. Pollard, I'm going to start with you. Would you compare and contrast your experience with Black studies early in your career with what you see taking place in the field now?
Thank you for the question. And may I say it really is good to be engaged with not only you, Dr. Benjamin, but also with Dr. Sherley. So thank you. Thank you. It's good to have these conversations. When I was still very young, but old enough to think that I knew something. And this explosion was taking place in 1968 with uprisings across 67, 68, 69, uprisings across the nation of Black folks in self-determination. These were pejoratively discussed in the media, of course, in public context, but in communities of Blackness, there was a recognition that a fundamentally seismic shift was taking place in the nation, and for the still relative few persons of African descent who were able to gain access to higher education, there was a real sense, a palpable sense that it was also time to provide leadership there in ways that had not been the case heretofore. And so a new Black-led movement, one that was born of civil rights, that was born of Black power, that was born of Black consciousness, emerged in higher education that eventuated in Black studies, beginning in 1969, especially and into the early 70s, San Francisco State, of course, and on, hundreds of programs that developed. And when I arrived in college at Fisk, the year was 1974. And by then, I was clear that it was, if you're going to have a well-rounded education, if I was going to have one, the only way to have it was to continue to be in. Now, you know, I'm a religion scholar, so I immersed myself in Blackness. The experience was incredible. We had the general educational kind of programs at our HBCU, but at Fisk, I think because of the historic resonance that had taken place there, and it was also, of course, the school of Nikki Giovanni. So there was a lot of, and Fisk couldn't handle Nikki, so they put her out, and she came back and did her own thing like she always did. And Jim Lawson was over at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and they put him out because they could not handle him either. But to come into this kind of environment and to know that I was going to learn about all of the disciplines in education, and all of them were going to be as much as possible centered in the experiences of Black people. This was an awakening that I had been hungering and thirsting for. And it took me through the continuity of all my educational experiences. Black studies, one of the things that to me was most profound about it was that, and I think sometimes it's forgotten even now, I think about it even in terms of my time at Howard University, certainly Fisk, that Black institutions were built, but we did not build them alone. There were Black and brown and white people of goodwill who were willing to embrace Black-led movements. And in this case, Black-led intellectual movements, but not simply Black-led intellectual movements, but intellectual movements that were going to foment change in the social order. So that it was not simply the Western norm of education for education's sake, but it really was about education for the public good, social good. And I think that has been the experience that I have seen, but it has vacillated, that I think understanding from decade to decade. We've had variations on the theme of whether our intellectual pursuits have always been committed to the public good, particularly to our communities of African descent. Sometimes the ivory tower has captured us too, and the ivory has replaced the ebony in our hue, and that has been regrettable. And I think the distinctions and divisions that sometimes have ensued thereby have redounded to the disadvantage of our communities. Now, especially with Trayvon and Sandra Bland and with George Floyd and all that has happened over the last 12 years in particular, with the uprisings again, not unlike the conflagrations of the 60s, I think that we are seeing the resurgence and the recognition that we have to be committed in our academic work as African American studies faculty, intellects, to make sure that we are doing this not simply on behalf of ourselves, but for others. The rise of women in particular in the field, I think really dominating the field, has, I think, had myriad constructive impacts, because the interlocking and intersectional recognitions that were sometimes theoretically espoused early on became more than theoretical. They became conceptual. And as a result, I think we're seeing a robustness, at least potential, in African-American studies now that is prepared to be more challenging to the extent academic order than it has been, I think, for quite some time.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And Dr. Sherley, I know that you're a student of Black Studies as a discipline. How does your work as a practitioner, and by practitioner, I'm thinking your work as a teacher, as a researcher, as a scholar activist, how does it build on and extend the long history of the field?
That's such a great question, Dr. Benjamin. And Dr. Pollard, thank you for that. I'm still thinking about your initial response to this question. And part of what I've been thinking while listening and thinking about your question, Dr. Benjamin, is that there's so much that's changed from the beginning of Black Studies in the university anyway, in the late 60s and early 70s to now. But one of the things that I think remains strikingly the same and shapes the way that I want to contribute to African American studies is our teaching mission and the stakes of that mission. I think our intellectual mission, one of the things that's both exciting but also challenging about our current moment is that it has gotten ever more diverse, and the commitments of scholars in Black studies around why we do the research that we do, who we're in conversation with, has proliferated. And I think that that has done some interesting things to the present intellectual moment of Black studies. But in terms of teaching and how I think about my own teaching as a practitioner, as you put it, Dr. Benjamin, I think the mission is the same. There are still foundational lies and myths about who Black people are that our students come to us to unlearn. And that it's our role to give them a real relationship to their history, not just a apocryphal story about what they think might have happened, though those do tell us and contain important information, but to actually help them develop their relationship to Black history, Black scholarship, Black culture, and its full breadth. And I think what that means for current students is different than what it meant 50 years ago, but the mission still feels the same. I'm teaching Intro to AFAM right now, and I had a student very sheepishly ask me, what was slavery just in the United States?
Mm.
And I said, that's a great question. The answer is no. And we're about to have a 30-minute lecture on why. And so our role of bringing a full global perspective, a full diasporic perspective of what it means to be Black, and in this context, in the U.S. South, what that means for being a Black person in the U.S. South, that mission is still the same, and it's been the same for a strikingly long time, and is still, unfortunately, as needed now as it was when I was a student, when my parents were Black students navigating some of these questions. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. I think on the kind of intellectual side of my practice as a member of this sort of Black studies community, I kind of want to pick up on what Dr. Pollard was talking about in terms of our commitment to community. And this is one of those things where I've been struck when, I just taught the students about San Francisco State and also about the Orangeburg Massacre in South Carolina before San Francisco State and the role of HBCUs in the founding of African American studies. And the thing that struck me in reteaching that material is that as faculty, we had a different relationship to students in the 70s than we do now. And I think there are pieces of that are still present. But when we said we had a commitment to the public, I think 50 years ago, we didn't just mean we spoke to the public, we brought our research to the public, but we organized with undergraduates, with community members to make these spaces possible. And Dr. Pollard, you're talking about the numerous people who were put out of their jobs as a part of that effort. And I think for great reasons, our relationship to students as a way for us to do our public mission, I think has changed. And we see, more Black studies folks who are public intellectuals in the sense that they are on TV. But the work, the more subterranean work of our most notable Black studies intellectuals of really working with students, with people in the community on the day-to-day. This is work I know Dr. Walker has been getting us, this is work we do in our department, but I think that the importance of that to our public mission has become less visible now. And there's a different kind of public intellectualism that's more highlighted now than it was 50 years ago. So one of my goals as a practitioner is to really hold on to those less visible ways of interfacing with the public, of being someone who's available in a more kind of like accessible sense, rather than someone who's just like a talking head on TV, to really bring my work to people in a way that speaks to them in the everyday, and to also teach in a way that's responsive. I've been talking to students on campus about what they want to learn, and they're interested in connecting what they're learning in the classroom to their immediate environment. So I think that's some of what I'm thinking about in terms of how do we continue these conversations in the present and tie them to our history as a discipline.
Yeah, those answers have me thinking about so many different things. And Dr. Sherley, I'm glad that you picked up, that you tugged a bit on that thread that Dr. Pollard introduced related to HBCUs, because I have, you know, as I'm scribbling my notes, a list of things that maybe we can come back to. And at the top of that list is Black studies at HBCUs. So often we think about this, we think about Black studies, Afro-American studies, African-American studies as an enterprise that occurred as a result of student protests at majority white institutions, as a way of not just getting content related to Black people, but also Black faculty. And so perhaps to, you know, as we move forward, we can come back to that idea, because I think it's really important in tracing this long history to be inclusive of the kinds of institutions we think about and we talk about when we talk about Black studies. The ivory tower as a place, you know, I think that these questions of academic elitism, and Dr. Sherley, you were kind of talking and gesturing toward this idea of the public face, but probably more so an academic celebrity, that we have folks who are out there who do the work of Black studies, and folks have their place, and we're needed in all kinds of areas, but to not forsake the fellowship, and to make sure that we are considering relevancy as a core principle to make what we do in the classroom, in our research, accessible to the communities that we serve, that are important to us, and who lifted us up along the way. Because I think this web of relationships that can't be overlooked, that we are, no matter how far we go in these intellectual spaces, we're never far from our people. And so making sure that we maintain those connections and those relationships, where there's give and take, and not the sort of, you know, we show up and we have the scholarship and, you know, it's thus saith, but really having our ears to the streets. The diasporic component, the role of demystifying and truth-telling for Black studies. You know, what happens when we put Black people at the center and we assume their humanity? And if we start from a place of the human, the kinds of questions that we then begin to answer. So yeah, those were just some of the things that I thought about with your comments. And I'm happy to come back to this toward the end, if there's anything that you'd like to revisit or take up. So I'm going to jump to our third and final question. And Dr. Sherley, I'm going to swing back to you. How can AAS, African American Studies, as a critical and interpretive lens, help us to understand our current political moment?
Well, I think the answer to that, Dr. Benjamin, part of it actually swings back to one of those last themes that you pulled out about centering the humanity of Black people, and how that is still an intervention in US culture to begin with that premise. We are currently in a moment where we might have the first Black woman and South Asian president of the United States. And Black studies is the lens that allows us to begin with the humanity of Harris as a candidate, to see her strengths, but to also see her as a person. I think sometimes there is an impulse, especially for white liberals, to swing from either no humanity to a pedestal. Black studies says we see Black people as people, which means we can analyze them in the real material cultural conditions that they are operating in. We can see Black people's brilliance, but we can also critique the places where we could see them do more for Black people. I also think that means Black studies gives us the lens to fully understand Black voters, what they care about, what they're thinking about. There's this kind of, I think a lot of people don't understand why Black voters vote the way that they do. Well, and their frustrations with the Democratic Party right now, and beginning with Black people's humanity, thinking about us as complex people, I think gives us the lens to make a grounded analysis of our current political moment. The second thing I'll say about this, that I've been teaching the students this semester, comes from Darlene Clark Hine, where she says that Black studies habit of mind means having nonlinear thinking. And part of what she means by that is that we can't just assume things get better. We also don't just assume that they get worse. There's also often this narrative that as time moves on, things get better and better and better, right? Things are better now than they were 50 years ago. They're better now than they were 100 years ago. But unfortunately, what Black studies also teaches us is that our progress is not assured, that we have to be vigilant about the dynamics in front of us to make sure that we don't backslide. And so I think those two things can work together, to both acknowledge our humanity and our brilliance as a positive presence always that can shape the future, but to also be honest that things don't just get better on their own and they don't just move in a linear fashion.
Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Sherley. So Dr. Pollard, to you, how can AAS as a critical and interpretive lens help us to understand our current political moment?
Thank you for the question. And I want to say first how much I just enjoyed what Dr. Sherley had to say. It was spot on. And it generated for me a number of things, but I think especially, well, two things, pretty much in the same vein, Dr. Sherley, you were just speaking about the utter humanity of Black people. One of the things that African American studies in this present moment can and must serve to remind us. And I think we did it to uneven degrees in 2008 with the presidency of Barack Obama. Some of us did forget that progress is not assured, that success does not look one way, and on and on. And so we became a bit too saccharine in our purviews about where the country was going. Some others of us, of course, went in a very different direction. But all in all, we have known the history of the United States of America a nation born in violence that begets violence, is that with every endeavor, with every undertaking, with every step that people of African descent have made in the stride toward freedom, there has always been tremendous and terrible backlash. There is no segment of US history where this is not the case. And for any of us to have thought that we had reached a crescendo or Shangri-La in 2008 was to miss the point of our nation's inheritance and our ancestral inheritance. And it would behoove us to remember that now in 2024, we are poised at the same precipice, but even more broadly, more deeply, a woman who is representative of two very significant racial ethnic groups in the social grouping of that, but also is a woman unabashed, a woman who is taking no prisoners, and in a society that still favors machismo and masculinities of a variety of sorts. This is something that we need to be, I think, watching very carefully. Our vice president, should she carry the day in November, will meet challenges that no other president has ever had to meet. Because in the United States of America, race matters, gender matters, sexuality matters, social income matters, and on and on and on. And we continue to differentiate rather than find our ways to the utter humanity that Dr. Sherley, I think, was speaking about, which brings me also back then to the whole, one of the beautiful things about, I think, where African-American studies is today and Black studies in general is that Blackness is a whole lot more complex than it used to be. It just, Blackness is not just about the folk who were born in the South or came from the urban North or urban West and made their biographies. It's also about those who have come to us from the Caribbean, who are more recent immigrants from Africa, who are coming from biracial contexts and multiracial contexts, and how do we understand what it means to be Black in our African American studies programs is also very much part and parcel for I think the work that we have been endeavoring to do. And the last point I would make is going back to Dr. Sherley's comments about the nonlinear thinking, which immediately brought to mind, for me, Angela Davis, and that progress is never assured, that freedom is a constant struggle. Coretta Scott King said virtually the same thing herself, that every generation has to pick up the mantle anew. And I think African-American studies is so beautifully positioned, particularly in higher education, to be a fulcrum, to make sure that the kind of complacency that sometimes overcomes our higher educational institutions, the malaise of thinking that we are perhaps doing it better than the rest of society, is something that has to constantly and vigilantly be challenged. And I don't think it's an accident that DEI initiatives, quote unquote, find themselves to be in difficult straits these days. We, as African American studies people, I think have to continue to do the critical analytical work that is also going to make sure that we have equity, that we have inclusion, that we have diversity, no matter what others may want to say about offices and hires across our educational and our corporate structures in the society. African American studies, we have a lot of work to do, and I don't see it ending anytime soon, which is for employable purposes, certainly a good thing. But for our community's sake, we have a great calling, and for that I am thankful.
Well, thank you so much, friends. We have a little more than 10 minutes before we'll wrap up. So if there's anyone on the webinar who would like to ask either of our panelists a question, please drop it in the chat. While we wait for that to happen, I have to say selfishly, I have a follow-up question. Because Dr. Pollard, what I want to do is bring together, Dr. Pollard, your earlier comment about the role of Black women in African American studies with Dr. Sherley's remark about understanding Black voters. And I'm interested in issues of gender. And, you know, when I kind of listen to the talking heads, or I'm scrolling Instagram or Twitter for whatever that's worth, I hear these narratives repeating themselves about this strife and the tension between male and female voters, Black male and female voters, that, you know, there are folks who see the candidacy of Kamala Harris as a continued effort of putting Black women to the fore, bringing them, you know, having prominence without giving men their proper due, or, you know, the time and space, the opportunity that they need to have their concerns heard. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts about that sort of tension and what African American studies can do to help us understand this sort of intraracial tension. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Dr. Sherley, you want to go first, or? I have plenty to say, but
No, you know what? Go ahead, Dr. Pollard.
Oh, all right. I'm from Minnesota. I'm actually from my mother's womb, but geographically, I'm from Minnesota. I taught at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, outside of St. Louis. In the aftermath of George Floyd, my family still heavily concentrated in Minnesota, but Michael Brown was St. Louis. I then went from there to Louisville Seminary and was in that city when Breonna Taylor was murdered by the police. And the leadership invariably in the movements for change in these locales were often and again the women, and particularly queer women. And yet and still that somehow has not translated very much into the public eye. There's an old African expression about women hold up more than half the sun. And I think that African-American studies in particular can really shine the light, if you will, on the utterly incredible capacity that women of African descent bring to our communities to make sure that culture, the glue that holds us together, that provides us with a binding strength, are celebrated, lauded, and critiqued in the manner that Dr. Sherley was talking about. None of us are exempt from any of those things, and yet for some reason, we have continued to, I think, be so rooted in the Western binary norms that we cannot see the fluidity of what freedoms we have to celebrate. And so we often talk about the yin and the yangs, but for me, it is very much the G and the Yame of the principles of masculine and feminine, and the blurring of the lines in between. And in our freedom struggles, we have just seen over and over again that if it wasn't for the women, if it wasn't for those who are queer, if it wasn't for those who are young, if it wasn't for those who are elderly, we could go on. And if it wasn't for some men too, we would not be making the strides toward freedom that we have made. And we need to embrace the philosophy, the African Ubuntu philosophy of I am because we are, and see that the impact that is made on those whom we would deem least significant in our community is the impact that redounds to those of us who considers ourselves to be so significant. And this ought to be something that we should have learned by now from the United States of America with redlining and mortgage loan crises and all these kinds of things. And yet we continue to fall right back into that same old, I'm going to show my age, that same old trick bag that the United States of America would seek to divide and conquer. African-American studies, we, I think, can really demonstrate, Dr. Sherley, Dr. Benjamin, that there is a better way forward. And it is a way that not only includes us all, but that absolutely affirms and embraces us all.
And yet the question is, why in African American culture are we not there? I mean, I think some of it, the United States it's a patriarchal country. And in regards to this question, what I mean by that specifically is it's a country that assumes men should lead. And I think one of the central tensions in African American history and culture around this question of gender is that part of the racism, part of the gendered racism of the United States is that is the containment of Black men so that they are not able to lead in a traditional patriarchal way. Something that Hortense Spillers, the Black feminist theorist, said once is that for so many years in African American history, we have seen that dynamic as something to be fixed and moved into the norm of American culture. That just like with white men, that we could complicate that, just like with white men, Black men should be able to lead so that Black women have the luxury of following. But what Hortense Spillers said, what she suggests in her seminal essay, Mama's Baby, that it's unfortunate that essay is so hard to read because what I'm about to say to me is the point of the essay. It isn't hard to understand. Is perhaps, like I think Dr. Pollard is pointing to and suggesting, that dynamic where because of the history of slavery, because of the history of racism, Black men have not been able to fulfill the traditional role of the patriarch. Perhaps that's an opportunity for Black people to have fundamentally different gender roles, gender dynamics, ways of approaching gender, a freedom in how we approach gender that's unique to us, that's uniquely Black. And what Spiller said 20 years later when she was asked about that argument she made in the 1980s, What do you think? Do you see it happening? Is it happening? And she says, no, I think there was a moment in the 1980s where there was this potential for Black men and women to renegotiate their relationship to each other, to find different modes of doing gender so they could accept each other, their contributions to our movements, and people who are outside of that rubric of just man or just woman. And when she was asked this question, I think in the early 2000s, she felt like that moment to have that reckoning was lost. But I think we are in a new moment since Hortense Spillers was asked that question, where, as you're saying, Dr. Pollard, you know, a new generation of queer people, LGBT people, of trans people are pushing their fellow Black folks and organizers to say, what about us? How does our presence here and the fact that we've always been here push us once again to think, hey, maybe there's an opportunity that comes out of our unique history as Black people to have a different kind of relationship to gender. And I think, to go back to your initial question, Dr. Benjamin, the thing that these commentators don't understand is that history. Why is it that there is this strife? Where does it come from? And what is the opportunity there, even when it seems unnavigatable? And the last thing I'll say about this is that I am actually teaching a class right now called Black Family Matters, where I have a group of cross-gender, cross-sexuality young Black students reading these older pieces of writing about the deep desire for Black patriarchy in American history. And I'm both heartened by how mystified they are by that desire. Why exactly would anyone want this? But also that they are in class finding ways to talk to each other rather than past each other about these questions. I felt like I was, I don't know, I felt like I was in the 70s in class on Tuesday, where these Black men and women were like really trying to work it out. But just the fact that they could have that conversation made me feel like this is how African American studies can, with showing people our history of why we're having these conflicts with each other, we can start to work together to move to something different that our unique history gives us an opportunity to discover together.
I love all of that. Thank you so much for your on your toes response to that question. Corey, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Shanna. Thank you so much, Eshe and Alton. I know these conversations can go on long into the afternoon, but we do have to, at this moment, close our conversation, put a pause in it for this particular moment, and we'll pick it up, of course, at many points throughout this year, and of course, next year, when we have our 5th annual AWFUBA AAS homecoming lecture. I want to thank our conversationalists, Dr. Eshe Sherley, as well as Dr. Alton Pollard III. I want to thank Dr. Shanna Greene Benjamin for expert moderating of today's conversation. And I want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support of the program in African American Studies here at Wake Forest University. We are truly building a unique intellectual community, and that community not only encompasses the Renolda campus and the broader Winston-Salem, North Carolina community, it also includes the communities of where you're located across this nation and across this world. We truly see Black Studies here at Wake Forest University as a planetary project, and it is something that really enables us to think about new futures for humanity and new futures for community. I'd like to end today's conversation with a statement that was 50 years in the making. It comes from an iconic essay by the late Vincent Harding. And here at Wake Forest University, we had the Vincent Harding Seminar, and we hosted Professor Harding for one of the last times he was with us before joining the Ancestors in 2014. And in that essay that was published in a 1974 edition of the Harvard Educational Journal, it's that iconic essay, The Vocation of the Black Scholar and the Struggles of the Black Community. Vincent Harding writes, "To speak now of building is to be faced with the reality that there can be no work no speaking of truth to the people, which does not force us into the future. For those Black scholars who recognize their profound relationship to ongoing life and struggles of the larger Black community, all work is a pathway to the next stage of the struggle. All history moves us towards the future. All analysis of contemporary setting seeks to find ways in which we may be situated for all the next times. Indeed, this conversation provided us with a description of an intellectual and personal journey of our conversationalists, an analysis of our contemporary moment, but also pointed us towards the future and invited us to engage in a journey so that we may build those next times. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great homecoming. Go Deeks!